Throughout the ages, many have held that there can be straight lines drawn from the creation week of Genesis to the week of ordinary life. And indeed, this is the Jewish year 5773, dated according to the Jewish calendar from creation. The reformers Luther and Calvin, who believed in a fixed earth, also held the 24-hour view. But there were others in the ancient world, long before Darwin or anybody else like that had ever been heard of, who suggested that, as Justin Martyr put it, that the days might have been long ages. He noticed that one of the Psalms said, 1,000 years in your sight are ours but yesterday, but it is past. And in the 2nd century, Clement of Alexandria thought that creation could not take place in time at all, since, I quote, time was born along with things which exist. And Augustine, who wrote a great deal about Genesis, openly stated in his book, The City of God, that he found the days of Genesis difficult. In fact, he held that God had created everything in a moment, and that the days represented a sequence used simply to explain it to us. Now, these men were not armchair theorists, and they existed long before the days of modern science. Many of them gave their lives, of course, for their Christian faith. So let's come to these Genesis days. The interpretations are many. I've counted 15 or 16, I think, but they morph into 3 or 4 main streams. Number 1, the 24-hour view. The days are 24-hour days of one earth week, less than 10,000 years ago. 2, the day-age view. The days represent successive periods of time of unspecified length. 3, the framework view. The days are not in chronological order, but they're in a logical order. The first 3 days representing form, and the second 3 representing fullness. The sky filled with birds, the sea filled with fish, and the earth filled with animals and human beings. And then there is the view that they are days of revelation, the time during which God revealed it to man. Now, that's a lot to take in at one blush, but I suspect most of you are familiar with this. But one thing I want to illustrate is the difference between logical and chronological order. If you compare Genesis 1 with Isaiah 45:12, you'll see what I mean. Here's Isaiah. I made the earth and created man on it. It was my hands that stretched out the heavens, and I commanded all their host. If you take that as a chronological statement, it means the earth was made before the heavens. But is it meant to be taken chronologically, or is it meant to be taken logically? When we are describing things, we often mix those two orders, depending on our point of view. So there are these various views. The framework view is one that is very much to the fore these days, particularly the version of it given by John Walton called the Cosmic Temple view. That is, I repeat, the idea that the first 3 and the second 3 days are in parallel. I would just make a simple observation that the fact that they are in parallel is fairly obvious, but the second thing is it doesn't mean that there's no chronology. You can't put birds in a sky that's not already there, to put it crudely. So even the framework view has implications of an implied chronology. Now, what should we think of all these different interpretations? Well, they make me very careful. And I do not claim, ladies and gentlemen, to have a definitive solution of this. But what I want to share with you, a number of things that have helped me think about it. The first thing we note is that they are different interpretations of the same text. Now, that is interesting because it means that people have a certain difficulty in understanding what this text means. And I suspect a lot of it comes from, in my experience, that not enough time has been taken to see what the text actually says, as distinct from what it means. Now, those two flow into each other. But what I'm going to try to do tonight is very briefly look at this again and take you through it and see what it says. If you look at the first chapter of Genesis, you first of all have a statement regarding the creation of the heavens and the earth in the first 2 verses. Then we have 6 days of God's creation and organizational activity, culminating in the creation of human beings in God's image. And then we have the 7th day of God's rest. So it's a very simple, an introduction, a middle, the 6 days, and as Aristotle would say, an ending. So that the initial, immediate impression is a chronological sequence of events, the briefest, if you like, of brief histories of time. It starts with an earth that is without form and void. There's nothing much there. It ends with the earth full of all kinds of life. And culminating the process is the highest form of life, human beings made in the image of God. And let me just stop there. The very fact of a sequence is fascinating, because it seems to be saying, whatever you believe about the days, that God did not create everything at once. There is a sequence with a goal. And what is the goal? It's human beings made in the image of God. Ladies and gentlemen, our world desperately needs to hear this today. Human beings are the only creature or thing in the entire physical universe that are said to be made in the image of God. The heavens declare the glory of God. It is nowhere said they were made in his image. You were made in God's image. And that distinguishes you above every other creature. You don't need me to remind you that in America and in the United Kingdom today, there is enormous pressure to devalue human beings to just another species. And before we get into the details here, just let's see what this text is actually saying. It's saying that you, as a human being, are uniquely valued because you are made in the image of God. That is an immensely powerful and important message. So there's a sequence of days and a rest, which becomes, of course, the model of our Earth Week. And in any age, readers of Genesis 1 would be familiar with this basic cycle of life, the human working week. And they would know the law of Exodus. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do your work, and so on. And the readers would clearly understand that Genesis 1 portrays God as a creative craftsman going about his week of work, taking rest each night from evening to morning, and then having a day of rest in the end. But of course, the thoughtful reader would realize a lot more, would realize that God's work of creation was vastly different from their work. We do not do the things that God does. Indeed, the Hebrew word for create is only used in the Bible with God as subject. The readers would also realize that their rest was not the same as God rests. God never slumbers or sleeps. And they would realize that God's creation week was never repeated, whereas theirs was. So there were points of contact between the Genesis week and the repeated Earth week, but there were major points of difference. But now comes the key question. What does Genesis actually say? Well, first of all, the word day, which is the crucial issue here. Well, the first mention of it in chapter 1 is verse 5, where we read, God called the light day and the darkness he called night. So what's the length of that day? Not 24 hours. By definition, it isn't. I find it spectacularly amazing, ladies and gentlemen, that people can read this text and insist that in every place where the word day in Genesis or the Bible occurs, it means a 24-hour day. The very first use doesn't. It contrasts day with night. And that reminds us of the multivalency of the word day in most languages. I came on Tuesday in the day is not saying the same thing twice. It's saying I came in the daytime. So the very first use of the word is the contrast between the 12 hours, at the equator at least, of day and night. So number one is not a 24-hour day. It's actually less. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the second occurrence is in the same verse. Day one involves evening and morning and would be naturally understood by Hebrews as what we would think of as a 24-hour day. So now we have two meanings for the word day, but there are more. We come to the seventh day, the Sabbath. There's no mention of evening and morning. And for centuries, people have asked why. And Augustine and many others made the sensible suggestion that God rested on the seventh day, but he didn't start creating again. That Sabbath rest has remained until today and is still going on. And hence, the word evening and morning is not appended to it. So there's at least one very long day that I find millions of Christians believe in anyway, without necessarily being aware of it. So the seventh day, arguably at least, is different from the first six, which is different from the first mention of the word day. God, of course, rested from his work of creation, not from his work of redemption. That is a different matter and is very important. But ladies and gentlemen, the implication of God resting from his work of creation, that is immensely important. Because it means that things were going on during creation that aren't going on anymore. So that the present is not a total key to the past. Now, of course, that is dynamite in certain academic circles, but I'm simply trying to see what Scripture is saying. It's saying that God did certain things and he stopped doing them. There was a rest. But then finally, in Genesis 2, verse 4, we meet the expression, when God created. But the word when there is the Hebrew word for day. And you see, here is now another use of the word day that we've all got. You know, in my young day at Cambridge, C.S. Lewis was a professor. You would never think of asking me, was that Tuesday or Wednesday? Because day there is an expression, for an indefinite period of time, isn't it? It's used in Hebrew in that way. It's used in most languages in that way. So now, looking at this fascinating text, we have several distinct meanings. They're all primary meanings, and they're all different. Now, this text is roughly 100 words. And here's a word used in 5 different senses, which warns me that this is extremely sophisticated writing. It may be very simple on the surface, but there's a sophistication to it that begins to emerge very rapidly. So how should we interpret all that? Well, the next point to make, I think, is this. Verses 1 and 2 of Genesis, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and so on. Those two at the beginning are separated from the period of days. I find many people haven't noticed that. Because every day from 2 on begins with, and God said. So you would logically expect that day 1 begins with, and God said, but that means that it's verse 3 and not verse 1. In other words, the creation of the heavens and the earth, however you interpret the days, according to the text, did not occur on day 1. Now that's very interesting, isn't it? Because if that is the case, and the Hebrew experts whom I have consulted tell me that the Hebrew changes the tense to make that extremely clear, that verses 1 or 2 are written in such a way as to indicate this occurs before the main narrative. Well, ladies and gentlemen, one of the major issues I hear around the place is, how old is the earth or the universe? I'm not so sure that Scripture even discusses it. Because whatever you think of the days, whether you think that there are days of 1 week or long days, if they were not at the beginning, then the beginning occurred at an indefinite time in the past. Now, if Scripture doesn't tell me when the beginning was, then why should I be dogmatic about it? Because it's not the issue. All right? Now, of course, a lot of things get conflated here. Because we loosely talk about the age of the earth, but there are several ages to be thought about, aren't there? There's the age of the universe, there's the age of the earth, and there's the age of life, and there's the age of humanity. They're not all the same. Even if you believe in a literal 6-day week, 10,000 years ago. They're not all the same. And it's important to differentiate them. I'm simply making point number one, that as far as I can see, the text of the Bible does not discuss the actual age of planet Earth at all. It simply tells us in the beginning, whenever that was, God did it. What it now concentrates on is a sequence of days. Well, you say, now, let's get down to it. You just told us evening and morning, day 1, day 2, that's a 24-hour day. That's exactly what I said, ladies and gentlemen. But now let's think again. Because there's another little thing. If you look at the Bible, you usually see the first day, the second, the third, the fourth. That's not what the Hebrew says. Hebrew has a word for the, hayom, the day. It's not used for days 1 to 5. It's only used for days 6 and 7. That's intriguing. Because you see, if you were thinking of a normal Earth week, you would either have them all without the article or them all with the article. You certainly wouldn't go, not the first day, but day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, the 6th day, the 7th day. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? Because you see, if we just think back, suppose you only had this page of Scripture. Forget science, forget everything else, just use logic on it and try to understand it. It's saying there is a sequence of days. We can presume they're 24-hour days, evenings and mornings. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they're in sequence. And they're days in which, and God said. But nothing in the text demands that they're days of a single earth week. They're the creation days on which God spoke. So here's a possibility. I wouldn't die for this, you know, although some of you might want me to die for it before I go tonight. But I'm only making a suggestion that opens up a vast possibility that what these days are is what they claim to be. God spoke. It didn't take him long to speak, if I might put it that way. And God said, and something happens. It might have taken a very long time for the potential of all of that to develop. And then sometime later, God speaks. And then sometime later, he speaks again. Which means, of course, that if there are any traces of this to be found, we would expect to find what we do find, the sudden appearance of new levels of complexity.